I asked you guys for questions, and boy did you deliver. I've got a bunch of questions and I'll try and answer them as best I can now. Hi, welcome back to Not So Obvious Watches. I'm Pete McConville. Last week I asked you for some questions. You've given me some and I'll do my best to answer them. A lot of them may end up having quite long and detailed answers. I'm going to give a little vignette of an answer today, and if it's more interesting I'll talk about it at length in a separate video. A lot of the questions are about me, which makes it lots of introspection and thinking about me, which brings me to something I brought up in the last video and some of you commented on. Some of you were concerned is the wrong word, but some of you asked questions about, expressed, I'll say, a concern that I became too introspective, too cut off from talking about the kind of industry analysis that drew some of you to the channel. Never fear, that's not going away completely. I'm just readjusting the balance a little bit. And in fact, if you saw my last COVID video, you would have seen sort of a return to that kind of analysis stuff I do. So like I said, I'm not giving up, I'm just shifting the balance a little bit. Okay, so with all of that said, let's just get into the questions. Okay, so Sparrowhawk basically said, you know, he understands I see bracelets, bands and straps as accessories, but what is it that I do look for in a watch? Well, I've done a deal breakers and a deal makers video talking about exactly that. Well, not quite that, but close. Some of the things that will definitely turn me off and some of the things that will definitely put me towards a watch. So I'll put links up around here somewhere when I figure out how to do that. But if I really wanted to boil it down to one thing, what I'm looking for is a sign that the designers had a clear intention to do something other than just churn out another watch, other than just stand at the sausage machine and keep on cranking, or ring the factory and say, send us 200 of number 42, please. I just need to see that the designers tried to do something and that they have, to the most part, succeeded in doing that. That is probably the thing I look for in every watch I buy. And the watches I'm cooling on in my own collection would be the ones where, now that I'm deeper into this hobby, now that I'm more into it, I can kind of better detect, hang on, they just churned the handle on this one. They haven't really thought hard about it. Super Yova asked a question, when traveling, do I pack my watches in like a travel case? And if so, do I recommend any? No, I don't. If I travel somewhere, I will always have, you know, a mountain of camera gear with me. Hang on, I do have. So generally what I'll do is I'll just get my watches, put them in a watch roll, wrap them up, normally stick them in a lens pouch, and then just put the lens pouch in one of the boxes in the hard cased, hard-shelled backpack. If I'm traveling, that is with me. Unless I'm in the hotel or something, that will never be, either that or its big brother will never be more than arm's length away from me. Jacinta Arthur, and in fact some of the authors asked me questions about my collecting strategy. I'm going to do a whole video on that, but very quickly, yeah, I have been sort of thinking about what is it that I'm going to do. If I'm going to collect watches, what would it be? Okay, so it's basically sub 5,000 US dollars, mostly tool watches, mostly Seiko divers, Alpinas, German watches with a focus on Müller Glasuta, the occasional stretch to more expensive watches like a Breitling, also focusing on GMT complications. I'm not particularly interested in chronographs, so I don't think I'm going to collect any of those, other than one or two which I think might be particularly iconic, possibly if it comes from those other brands I collect. I also do collect vintage Alpinas. Okay, so the Arthur family also asked me a question about some other things. What do I think my next vintage watch will be? Funnily enough, I'm actually thinking my next vintage watch won't be an Alpina, and this isn't entirely vintage, and it is a chronograph, so maybe I just completely blew everything out of the water. But I'm really tempted by a mid-90s Breitling Cosmonaut. I've been stewing on that watch for probably about a year and a half now, and I'm getting close to saying that's the one I want. If I'm talking about a new watch, probably the Alpina Star Timer Heritage GMT. I love Alpina watches, I love GMT watches, and I don't have either yet. So that's probably my next new watch. Scott C asked a question about when you could expect to see the 200 series classes for my watch collecting thing. Probably in about 6 weeks, Scott. I'm working that up now. Really glad. Most people seem to really enjoy the 100 series classes. 200 series classes are in development up here right now. It's being a bit tricky because I'm being the whole tenet of my watch collecting philosophy, watch collecting discussion philosophy, is about helping you collect whatever watches you want, however you want, in ways that make you happy. And so to do that, to talk about that in ways that don't sort of have my assumptions, my feelings, what I want in that, is really quite challenging. And so it's taking me a little while to sort of think about how to say what I want to say, but never fear, they are coming probably about 6 weeks from now. Ilfonso asked 3 questions, and I apologise sincerely if I butchered your name, mate. I tried. Okay, so the first question was, why do I think women aren't into watches that much? Okay, the first thing I would say is, I'm not sure that women aren't into watches as much as men. I've heard quite a number of watchmakers say that at least half their watches are sold to women. I think perhaps a better question is, why aren't women into this watch community the way that men are? And I think that's a couple of things. One, women have more options when it comes to jewelry. So the passion and the interest that we men pour into a watch, and I should also say money, that we pour into a watch, for women is diluted because it's also with a ring or two and a bracelet and a necklace and earrings and all sorts of other jewelry options which are open to men but aren't really seen in the same light. They're definitely, for most men, would be seen as the next rung down. Whereas I think for women, watches just fall, for many women, watches just fall into that general pool of jewelry and accessories. The next thing is, this community is very male dominated. And if you look at the way that male and masculine online communities work, it's very different to a lot of female and feminine ones. A lot more gatekeeping, a lot more macho peacocking, hierarchy enforcing, status displays. It's probably, I suspect many women don't find it a particularly welcoming place. I've seen on my channel people use, that something was feminine as an insult, which really made me feel uncomfortable, which made me delete that. But then on the same time, it's like, because I don't, that sort of thing makes, if you're a woman and you come to a forum and you see that your is being used as an insult for other people, why would you want to be here? So yeah, in general, I think that women probably are into watches, maybe in a slightly different way to men, but the biggest issue is most men don't create environments that they really want to play in when it comes to this community side. The next question you asked was, do I think that the watch collecting is borderline obsessive and a little unhealthy? No, but I think it can be. I think the line between collecting and hoarding can get a bit blurry, is always quite thin. generally there's a couple of kind of psychological tests you can run to decide which side of the line you're on. The ones I can remember offhand would be, can you say why you bought this watch? And that is, if you can look at a watch and say, I bought this watch because of this, because it fits here, because I want it, because I moved here, because it makes me feel these ways, that's a good sign. If you look at the watch and you find yourself wondering, I'm not sure why I bought this, other than the fact that I buy watches, that's a bad thing. If you don't really get a lot of pleasure out of the watches that you buy, that's a bad sign. If you every time you buy a watch, you're filled with joy, you really enjoy it, you can't wait to wear it again in the morning. When you buy a watch, you make sure that you just find yourself wanting to look at it occasionally. That's all really good. If you find you're buying a watch, enjoying unwrapping it, enjoying opening it, put it to one side, and then are immediately looking for the next watch you're going to buy, bad sign. The last one is probably actually the most serious, is, are other people missing out because of your watch collecting? Are your friends and your family missing out on you, your time, your attention, the things? Are they worst of all, are they going without things that they should expect to get because you're spending your money on a watch? If you give a wrong answer to that question, you've got a problem. And so yes, you have crossed that line from healthy hobby to unhealthy pathological obsession. Your last question was, why do I think there's a relationship? Why do I think there's such a relationship between cars and watches? I suppose I'd shrink that down. Okay, this is totally just out of my own head. I've got no research to say this. I don't necessarily think there is a really hard connection between cars and watches. I think there's quite a hard connection between cars and tool watches. I've got a sneaking suspicion the few people I know that are really heavily into collecting dress watches aren't particularly into cars or cameras or any of that other stuff. But the guys that I know that are into tool watches, like dive watches and aviation watches, are also into trains, planes and automobiles. They've probably got a drone. They're into cars. They've probably spent more than they should on cameras. So I think between tool watches, cars and all that other tech stuff, because it's techie and it's cool and it's fun and it's what we do. BJJ Rhino first off said, can I do a review on the brand Sinn? Yes, I can. I would love to. I don't know much about them though, so I'm going to make zero promise on the time frame for that. I'm going to have to do a fair bit of research and some thinking. I do actually have feelings about that brand, which does make it easier. It's a brand I kind of feel positive towards. It's a brand I'm motivated to know more about, so it's not going to be a stretch for me, Rhino. I'm just going to I just don't know enough to be able to say anything really intelligent. The next question you asked was, what are the planes? What are the photos of the planes behind me? They are okay. So they're some of the presentations I've been given by units I've left when I've moved on. In rough chronological order, I won't point to them or anything. I'll put a picture up of the aeroplanes. One is of a C-130H Hercules cargo aircraft that came from the unit that I worked in when I first graduated, and we used to do depot level or base level maintenance on these aircraft, tearing them down to their base aluminium, doing all the maintenance, putting them back again and sending them back out to fly. The next one, there's a picture there I think of a 707 that's in the Air Force. We used to use those as strategic transport and tankers, air-to-air refueling tankers. I was the senior engineering officer in charge of all maintenance on the RAF fleet, which was 6 aircraft and 1 squadron. Makes it sound a bit more grandiose, but that was my job. I got that presento when I left that job. And I've got 2 photos of the same aircraft up there, of the wedge tail airborne early warning control aircraft. I was the certification manager or aircraft team lead in the project office in Seattle, representing the Commonwealth to Boeing, and checking that they had met all of our safety criteria so that we could certify the aircraft and fly it. And then when I came home from that, I became the first chief engineer, accepting the first bunch of aeroplanes back into Australian service, setting up support structures, dealing with day-to-day engineering and maintenance issues, and also dealing with kind of all the stuff which inevitably doesn't quite get finished in acquisition, and managing the mod programs through and getting those finished. So yeah, those are the aeroplanes that I've got up there. They all kind of mark, the reason why I've got those ones up there is they mark particularly interesting and important times in my career. James Arthur has asked me a question about micro brands, and I think his question was really, how do I feel about the fact that these brands are often extraordinarily thin in terms of, you know, capital and backing? Yeah, I do. I suppose I'll answer that sort of from a moral and ethical view, and then my personal level of comfort point of view. Morally and ethically, I don't have a problem with it. Frankly, new brands are, it doesn't matter what your technology area is, new brands are always going to have that problem of not having a long history and not having a massive capital tail. We're generally talking about products that cost, you know, $5-ish, $100, maybe occasionally topping out at about $1,000. In that space, warranties of, you know, if I bought a television that costs that much, a warranty would normally be 1, maybe 2 years. Most of these guys, I think you can, most micro brands, you could count on them at least being able to cover their warranties for a year or so. And most of these brands, by the way, if you're coming to them through Kickstarter, you should know that this is a high risk environment. So I don't personally have a problem with the idea that these brands exist, that they operate this way, that they are very thin. I recognise that there's a risk that they could fold and all those warranties are worth nothing and they're not backed. But given that we aren't talking massive amounts of money, given that we are talking about products which ultimately are discretionary, given that these products are being sold through and financed through an avenue which is widely known to be very high risk, I don't have any kind of professional issue, ethical issue with how micro brands are working in that space. What's on my desk asked for my thoughts on the whole watch industry post-COVID. Well, I ended up doing a whole video on that, mate, so I'll put a link up to that right now. Go check that out, and I think I rabbited on for about 20 minutes on that idea. David Jones asked me what were my thoughts on Patek and high horology, knowing it's not my channel, but you know, think about. I find it eminently curious. It's funny. It's intellectually satisfying for me, but not emotionally connecting. So if I'm browsing YouTube or flicking through a magazine and I see, you know, like the insides of a Morris Grossman or the insides of a Patek or something like that, or an FP Journe, I am fascinated, but I'm not involved. So my view on it is I think it's fantastic that it exists. I think it's really intricate and wonderful and worthy of doing and worthy of attention and worthy of someone else's affection, but just not mine. I don't connect with it at all. There's probably one variation on that, and that's when you've got companies that do kind of play in my space. When companies that are in that space occasionally reach up into high horology, that does take me with it. The best example I could give there would be, say, JLC. I do find JLC is a brand, don't know why, it's worth more investigation on my behalf, but JLC is a brand that I really do have some affection for. And you know, I can look at a Polaris and think I could own one of those. I could own a Polaris. I could own, you know, an older master compressor. And so they do drift around on my list. They've never quite got to the top, but they're kind of there. And then when I watch that brand and I look at that brand and watch as it sort of ascends into high horology, that brand does take me with it. So I do find myself interested in what, say, JLC does in that space more than, say, Patek, who for me live exclusively in this rarefied, I don't care about you kind of space. Scott C asked a second question on that about how about the financial impacts and the constraints that come with buying into that super high horology. And mate, you're absolutely right. I think I've mentioned this before, that there's a little part of me, and I won't know for certain until it's tested, but I have a suspicion that it wouldn't matter how much money I had. If I get to the point where I have to think half my watches are going to be kept in a safe, if I get in a bank deposit vault or something like that, if I get to the point of saying I now need to take extraordinary measures to manage this watch, to keep it safe, I no longer will get joy from it. And that's possibly one of the reasons why I feel distanced a little bit from high horology, that I don't think I would ever I don't think I would ever really be comfortable with it. I think I'd always feel on edge, on guard. And so, yeah, just the sheer amount of money involved always means I'll be interested in it in the same way as I'm interested in someone else's really nice, $1 million Ferrari. But Christ no, I don't want to drive it. Marcus F actually gave me a long question, actually a long post talking about some thoughts about what's going on in the COVID industry. And again, Marcus, you and I were thinking very similar things. I think I discussed about half of the sorts of things you're talking about there in my video on COVID. So I'd be really interested in your comments on that one. You did actually ask me some questions as well. You're right, I've got a large collection, and you asked me, how do I choose what to wear? Basically, I have three parts of the collection. There's a whole bunch of vintage stuff and particularly sentimental watches, like gifts, or the watch the Air Force issued me when I joined, or a watch my parents gave me when I graduated, or my father's old watch. They form like a pool of very special occasions, only very rarely. They're collectibles and mementos at least as much as watches, probably more. So they live in their own special space, and that would probably be half of the watches I own. At the other end, you're absolutely right. There's probably not 5, I would say there's 10 watches which are really my core go-tos that I will pick from, really on the basis of have I worn them recently, that are in constant rotation. And if you look at my Instagram, it wouldn't be too hard to figure out what those ones are. I'll go through this in more detail another day. But they're things like my Marine Master, this Sumo, my Breitling Super Ocean, the Bell & Ross GMT, the 2 Mueller Glasutas, the Edox Hydra Sub. There's probably Alpina, certainly the Star Timer, probably also the Sea Strong 300 Diver. So that's probably every second, I'm probably wearing one of them 4 out of every 5 days. In the middle, there's a relatively small bunch of watches which aren't quite collectors and mementos, aren't quite daily drivers. They crop up every now and then. Most of those are probably leftovers. I won't say leftovers, but they're mostly the watches I bought when I was kind of forming my opinions about where I wanted to go. So they've they're early stages, they're early prototypes in my collection, but they're still special to me. And the whole way I approach buying a watch, I didn't buy them thinking I would on-sell them. I don't feel a need to on-sell them. Maybe I will one day, but not yet. The next question you ask is, do I have a way of checking for watches needing a service? I'm a terrible watch collector. I don't do it. When you're looking after aeroplanes, you can either do it on time or on condition. I do it on condition. First off, I never buy I buy every vintage watch expecting that I'm going to have to give it a service. If I don't have to give it a service, I have scored a bonus and I've saved myself some money. So I essentially look at every watch I buy and think to myself, I might have to spend that much again getting it serviced. So that's kind of how I build that into my purchasing decision. I have only had to do that twice so far of all of my vintage watches, so I'm so far I'm doing pretty well. What I tend to look for is not so much accuracy, because I don't track accuracy that much, but I'll stick them on a time grapher and I'll look for beat error and amplitude. If that's starting to get all over the place, I know there's something going wrong. Accuracy you can kind of regulate out, but those are signs that there's something not quite right. Getting very close to the end now. JC84 asked, have I had or do I have a Grail watch? Yes, I do. Not in the sense of this Grail would be the one and only watch that would stop me in my tracks and I wouldn't have to buy any more. That's not really how I think about Grails. It's probably the right way to think about it, but it's not how I approach it. I think of Grails as those watches which represent the most you would ever want, the pinnacle of where you'd want to get to. Now, I've got a couple of watches that bounce around that, but there's one in particular that has been on the top of that list for, God, 2 years or so, and that is the Bulgari Octo Finissimo in stainless steel with the slightly satinized finish, not the slightly older matte one, mainly because it comes with a 100-meter water resistance. That watch is probably 3 times, 2.5 times what I would normally want to spend on a watch, but is still within my comfort level. I wouldn't, if I bought that watch, and then I wouldn't ever feel uncomfortable or feel like I had to take extraordinary measures looking after it. So that's kind of my Grail. That's where I would live. Andreas has asked a question about me and bikes and what watches do I wear when I ride a bike. I don't wear a watch when I ride a bike. They're uncomfortable when you're sitting with your hands on the bars. They kind of knock. Mechanical watches don't like the vibration that you get through the bike handlebars. And what the hey, I've always got a Garmin, so I just use the Garmin when I'm on a bike. If I'm using it just to get somewhere, as in if I was commuting, then whatever watch I'm wearing is wrapped up in a shirt and stuffed in my back. It's not on my wrist. And the last 3 questions I can answer really quickly from Anonymous. Do I own a Rolex? Have I owned a Rolex? And will I own a Rolex? No, and extremely unlikely. There's a whole video in why that is, and I'll do that pretty soon. But no, I do not own a Rolex. No, I have not owned a Rolex, and I'm never going to say never, but it is extremely unlikely that I would own a Rolex. It's not my brand. Their story, I don't want their story to be part of my story. So that's really the main thing about Rolex. Anyway, that's it. That's every question. I have no idea how long I've been speaking, but my throat's getting sore. So hopefully I can edit this into something useful. I've been Pete McConville. This has been Not So Obvious Watches, me talking for far too long, and I'll see you later. Bye.